Hi, I'm Beth Tomlinson, Senior Director of Education with United Way of Greater Lehigh Valley and lead backbone staff for Resilient Lehigh Valley. Resilient Lehigh Valley is a cross-sector coalition dedicated to creating a trauma-informed and resilient community for all people across all ages through raising awareness on the impact of trauma, particularly childhood trauma, as well as historical trauma, providing trainings on trauma and trauma-informed practices, increasing collaboration and information and resource sharing between providers and sectors to really break down silos, advocating for trauma-informed policies, legislation, and funding at both the local, state, and federal levels. This training should be about 1 hour. The focus for today is to develop an understanding of what trauma is, its impact on the brain and body, both for students and staff, its impact on student behavior and performance, helping to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in students, as well as a new pilot, the Handle with Care pilot, which is an enhanced police-school communication model to better support students exposed to trauma. Best practices for a trauma-informed approach, including multi-tiered system of supports, MTSS, as well as signs of secondary trauma, vicarious trauma in staff. This presentation is also aligned with Act 18 requirements. So to begin, what is trauma? The best way to remember what trauma is and understand what trauma is are the 3 E's. Individual trauma results from an event or series of events or circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has a lasting adverse effect on the individual's functioning, whether physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. What's important to note with this is that it is experienced. So individuals can experience events very differently. The same event experienced by one student might not be considered traumatizing to that child, yet it might be for another. When we think of lasting adverse effects, usually we think of seeing symptoms that persist for more than 3 weeks. Right? If you're seeing symptoms of hyperarousal, lack of focus, nightmares, agitation for 3 weeks or longer, that's usually a good indication that the child was exposed to something that child considered traumatic. What's also important as we begin this training is to really consider it really is a balance of those risk and protective factors. We can't always control the negative experiences, childhood trauma, the risk factors that children are exposed to, but what we can control, particularly as educators, are the positive protective factors that children are exposed to. And the life outcome of a child really is that balance of risk and protective factors. The greater the risk factors, the more protective factors that child really needs to heal from the trauma, to develop a strong sense of agency, and to really be able to succeed not only in school, but in life as well. So you're walking in the woods on a beautiful sunny day, and you see this guy. What happens in your body? Take a moment to reflect. What does your heart feel like? What do your muscles feel like? Are you focused? We would see heartbeat elevated. We would see a shortness of breath. We would see your muscles tightening with energy pouncing through your muscles. You would feel jumpy, like you're going to jump out of your skin. Your body temperature might be changing as well. These are all signs of stress responses, adrenaline and cortisol pumping through your body to help you run faster, fight harder, or stay really, really still and wait for that bear to pass you. Right? That is what our stress hormones feel like in our body when our fear part of our brain is triggered. Now, if you are walking in the woods on a beautiful sunny day and you see this guy, is it a choice for your body to react that way? No. Unconsciously, your brain is taking over. Your brain is hijacking the rest of your brain, right, to jump into that fight, flight, or freeze, to take. You're not thinking it through, you're not reasoning it through, you're just reacting. Your brain is taking over to react in that fight, flight, or freeze mode to take you to safety, because our brains are hardwired for survival, and survival trumps everything else. Now, what happens If we live with that bear, then it's likely those stress hormones are triggered every day because we have a sense of fear every day. For children that live with that bear, what we also call toxic stress levels. They don't know if it's tonight or tomorrow night, but that threat happens often enough that they feel they need to be prepared for it all the time. They're constantly looking for small signs of, is it safe, is it not safe? Is it going to be a good night, is it going to be a bad night? So their brains are constantly scanning the environment for small clues of, is it going to be safe or not safe? They have adrenaline and cortisol, those stress hormones pumping through their brains and bodies all the time. It actually can weaken their immune system. You'll see higher rates of eczema, bronchitis, other infectious diseases, things like that, gastrointestinal problems, headaches, migraines. With students that are exposed to toxic stress as well, you'll see changes in behavior, attitude, social connections, attachment. And we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. And if you live with that bear at home or in your neighborhood, you might start to see bears everywhere because your brain might be stuck in survival mode, constantly scanning the environment for those small clues of, is it safe, is it not safe? So if we look at the picture in the middle of this slide, you might look at that child in the middle and think, oh, well, that child's very happy, surrounded by friendly students, with a really kind mentoring teacher behind him, supporting him. But from a trauma lens, if that child in the middle has had bad touch or experienced or lived with an abusive man in the home, now he's confined, he is in a small child desk, he's got students all around him, he's got no space around him, there's a lot of laughter and noise around him. Noise can be very triggering. And he's got a man hovering behind him with his voice behind his ear. He might feel trapped. All these indications, the noise, the feeling trapped, feeling like they can't escape, the loss of control, and that male voice behind him might all be triggering past traumas. And then you might see that child acting out, cursing staff, flipping the table, right, having an outburst, and then being sent to the principal's office. So it is really important that we begin to build our trauma lens to really understand the behavior we're seeing, understand the risk factors, the triggering events, and minimize them in the classroom. So we know everything we know about childhood trauma from a groundbreaking study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs study. It was in the late 90s. Many of you have probably already heard of it. And what they did, they surveyed about 17,000 people in California back in the late 90s through a health insurance company. And they asked these 17,000 people under the age of 18, did you experience any of these 10 adverse childhood experiences, otherwise known as ACEs? Physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical, emotional neglect, or 5 different signs of household dysfunction. A family member with mental illness or a substance abuse issue, an incarcerated relative, a mother treated violently, or divorce or loss of a parent or caregiver. And what they found from this study was 2/3 of this population could say yes to at least one of these ACEs. That would give them an ACE score of 1. And about 13%, or 1 in 8, could say yes to 4 of these. That would give them an ACE score of 4. What they also found was if you said yes to 1, having an ACE score of 1, there was an 80% chance that you would say yes to more than 1. So a lot of these ACEs are interconnected. For example, if I were to say yes to my father was an alcoholic, right? Likely when my father was drunk, perhaps he was physically abusive to my siblings and myself. That would give me an ACE score of 2. Perhaps when he was drunk, he was abusive to my mother. That would give me an ACE score of 3. Because my mother was abused, she was depressed. That would be an ACE score of 4. Because she was depressed, she was emotionally neglectful. That would be 5. Because of all this family dysfunction and abuse, my parents got divorced, and maybe my father got incarcerated. So right there, we went from an ACE score of 1 to an ACE score of 7. This research also found that for those individuals with an ACE score of 4 or more, that was that living with a bear. That was that toxic stress level. And for those individuals who grew up with toxic levels of childhood traumatic stress, they were significantly more likely to develop any one of 7 of the top 10 adult killing diseases: obesity, depression, suicide, Alzheimer's, heart disease, stroke, and various different cancers as well. In part because they adopted risky behaviors that led to these other illnesses, but also in part because that constant influx of stress hormones weakens the body at a cellular level, and really weakens the immune system over time, such that it led to negative long-term physical and behavioral health outcomes. Additionally, this study found that those with an ACE score of 6 or more were significantly likely to lose 20 years of their life expectancy, again because of the traumatic impact that these stress hormones, this constant flooding of stress hormones, has on your brain and body over time. Now, a newer way of looking at ACEs, or childhood trauma, is to look at the pair of ACEs. The original ACE study really only looked at factors in the home, risk factors in the home. A more modern way of looking at childhood trauma is really looking at the whole environment for the child, both the factors in the home as well as in the school and in the neighborhood. So in 2014, Philadelphia conducted the ACE study again, but wanted to look at an urban environment. When the original ACE study was conducted in California, just looking at those 10 original ACEs, they sent that survey out through a private insurance company, and not surprisingly, the majority of that population, that original ACE study population, was white, college educated, working full-time, and full-time employed. And still within that white, more affluent, more educated population, still, right, 2/3 had experienced childhood trauma, and 1 in 8 had that toxic level living with a bear type of traumatic stress. So the Philadelphia study wanted to look at, well, what does this look like in an urban environment like Philadelphia that has more racial and ethnic diversity, as well as more socioeconomic diversity. So they asked Philadelphia members, residents, the same questions as the original study, but added onto it if folks had experienced bullying, institutional racism, experience in the foster care system, and witnessing or hearing violence, in addition to the original 10. And through the Philadelphia study, they found that now over 80% of the adults had experienced at least one traumatic childhood event. So we go from 2/3 now to over 80%. And over 1/3, almost 4 in 10, reported 4 or more ACEs. So again, now we move from about 12, 13% to 37%, right? So the rates triple. What that tells us, that does not tell us that poverty equates trauma, or that being a person of color equates trauma. But what it does tell us is that in communities where there's higher concentrations of poverty and more exposure to institutional racism and police brutality, that individuals and children are more at risk for either family, school, or community traumatic incidents. So what both studies tell us is that childhood trauma is sadly very common. It's in every community, whether an urban area like Allentown, Bethlehem, and Easton in the Lehigh Valley, or our suburban or rural areas. So how does trauma impact the brain? That living with the bear, that traumatic stress level, that toxic stress level, can really disrupt the development of the brain chemistry, and our nervous system. It can impair social, emotional, and cognitive development. It can weaken the ability to regulate emotion and manage impulse control. And it disrupts the development of our organs, our circulatory system, our immune system, and our inflammatory response system. Our bodies really were not wired to constantly be processing those stress hormones on a daily basis. Our brains and bodies were wired for safety, and then those stress hormones to flood in only in moments of threat. And then that moment of threat, that fight or flight freeze response gets us to safety. Once we get to safety, we calm down and we turn off those stress hormones. That's how our brains and bodies are designed. But for children living in more constant or frequent threat situations, again, those stress hormones are flooding all the time. That fight, flight, or freeze mode, that survival mode is turned on all the time, and it can significantly impact brain development. So like a needle on a record player, complex trauma, that toxic level of stress can wear a groove in the brain. So signs and symptoms of trauma in youth. As you look through this slide, pay attention to the age range up top. We have some preschool, elementary school, secondary school. Look through the signs and symptoms. Are these any of the behaviors you see in your classrooms that you struggle with? If so, exposure to trauma might be the root cause of the behaviors you're seeing. Another helpful tip, as you look through these signs and symptoms, and then look down at the bottom of this image, you'll see the most common behavioral health diagnoses for youth that match these symptoms. In most schools, ADD, ADHD rates are through the roof. And from here, we can see that the signs and symptoms of ADD, ADHD match the signs and symptoms of trauma. So I would question, does your student have ADD, ADHD? Or is it actually those stress hormones, that adrenaline and cortisol pumping through their body, that you can see their body struggling with those stress hormones? So lack of focus, hyperactivity, fidgety, impulse control, quick trigger, regressive behaviors. So trauma-informed practices does help all students, regardless if they have a trauma history or not. They do help all students feel safe and supportive. So you can apply the same trauma-informed practices to an entire classroom and benefit all students. So before we show this video, the full video is about 13 minutes. They are actor portrayals, so this is not a real documentary. These are actors. I'm only going to show about 3 minutes. The video is sad, but it does indicate from a child's perspective what living with trauma feels like and what it feels like to live with trauma and walk into your school. So I just want to be mindful before this clip plays to protect your own emotional safety. So recognize these are actors, but even knowing that they're actors, it is sad. It could be triggering for you as well, particularly if you have your own childhood trauma past. So I just want to caution and make sure that you're mindful of your own emotional safety. So take some deep breaths while watching this. If you need to get up and walk away, get a nice cold drink of water and come back, I would encourage you to do so if this is triggering for you.
Sometimes someone hurts you so bad.
I don't think you understand me.
It stops hurting at all. Until something makes you feel again. And then it all comes back. Every word, every hurt, every moment. you ever understand where I come from? Even if you ask, even if you listen, you do not really hear or see or feel. You don't remember my story. You haven't walked my path. You haven't seen what I've seen. My past defines me. This is who I am. I am unseen, unheard, unwanted. That is what I am, if even I am anything.
So now might be a good time to pause and reflect on the video and the signs and symptoms. So another key tool to understand behavior and respond to behavior is the window of tolerance, and really helping youth and even staff, even ourselves, this works with adults as well, to widen our comfort zone and get more comfortable and grow our tolerance for discomfort and widen that window of tolerance, right? So ideally, we want to be in the comfort zone where we're emotionally regulated, we're able to self-soothe, we feel calm, cool, collected, connected. When we're in that zone, that's when we can function at our best. That's when our reasoning, our critical thinking, our impulse control, that's when everything's really firing and we're able to really, really achieve. And when we talk with our, even with peers, with each other, that's where we want to be in professionally, but also with our students, that's where we want our students to be so that they can learn, grow, challenge themselves, learn new skills, build new skills, and really achieve. But for those students, for any student, when they sense threat, but particularly for those students that have experienced trauma and traumatic events, they find it harder to stay in the comfort zone. It's hard for them to get into that zone, and it's harder for them to stay in that zone because, again, their brain's constantly scanning for, am I safe, not safe? What are the clues? What are the clues if I'm safe or not safe? That really keeps them outside of this comfort zone. So what helps students when they leave this window of tolerance, this comfort zone, what strategies to help them get back into that? Mindfulness, right? They're really learning how to feel your body and what your body is feeling, being in the present, be in the here and now. Pull yourself back from that traumatic memory into the here and now moment. Grounding exercises do that as well. Self-soothing, calming the body, emotional regulation, deep, slow breathing, helping to recognize limiting behaviors and beliefs, right? Helping to counter with positive statements about ourselves, and learning new tools to handle when we're feeling uncomfortable. So when we're outside this window of tolerance, this comfort zone, you'll either see in youth this hyper aroused state, which is that fight or flight response. So anxiety, feeling overwhelmed, chaotic responses, outbursts, anger, aggression, rage, rigidness, obsessive compulsive behavior or thoughts, overeating or restricting, addictions, impulsivity, or the freeze response in youth, hypo-aroused. They might be feigning a death response, completely disassociating, kind of zoned out look on their eyes, feeling like they're not really present, really shut down, being unavailable, significant memory loss, feeling disconnected, just being an autopilot, no display of emotions, kind of a flat affect, really feeling separate from their bodies and their feelings and their emotions. Another important thing to note with youth, the younger the child especially, the younger child exposed to trauma because of their vulnerability and their age, they often divert to a freeze response where they kind of disassociate from what's happening because they're not big enough or strong enough to fight or flee from the situation. So with younger students, you especially see more of that freeze response as well. So trauma-informed approaches and emotional regulation and social emotional learning strategies really help the child stay more in that comfort zone, stay longer in that comfort zone, and have the tools and strategies when they feel themselves pulling into that freeze response or that fight or flight response to get back into that comfort zone. And that's really where we want them to be. Right, so why should school leaders care about trauma? I think you all know the answer to this. It doesn't take much trauma exposure to see an impact in school. Research tells us it only takes an ACE score of 2 to see 2.6 times more likely to fail a grade, 2 times more likely to be suspended, 5 times more likely to have an attendance problem, and 6 times more likely to have a behavior problem in school. So just an ACE score of 2. Think how common that is. A parent with a substance abuse issue and divorce, or emotional neglect and a substance abuse issue, right? If we think about the students in our classroom and we think back to that pair of ACEs of things that can happen in the home or in the school or in their neighborhood, it doesn't take much to get to an ACE score of 2. So this really affects most of our children in our classrooms and most of us adults as well. So the Handle with Care pilot that is launching September 1 of 2020, so this coming September. Handle with Care is a program to support children exposed to trauma and violence through improved communication between law enforcement and schools. It promotes partnerships aimed at ensuring children who are exposed to trauma receive the appropriate interventions, care, and support through the schools and through community-based partners associated with the school so that students can achieve academically and socially. Handle with Care started in West Virginia in response to the opioid epidemic that just devastated that community. Schools were finding significant and rising behavioral challenges in the students, along with higher chronic absenteeism and lower academic performance as well. And when they really got to the root cause of it, they were finding that the children were showing up to school the morning after, a family member or a parent or caregiver had overdosed. And the schools had no idea until behavior had escalated. So they initiated the Handle with Care program to really find out as early as possible when law enforcement might be involved with a child so that they can more proactively reach out to children to support them and help the child heal. Our particular Handle with Care pilot in the Lehigh Valley is in partnership with the Safe to Say Something system, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It's also in partnership with both district attorneys for Lehigh County and Northampton County, as well as the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. So how does Handle with Care work? Schools will receive a Handle with Care referral through the Safe to Say Something system. The referral will show up as an event. Other events in the Safe to Say system are, self-harming behavior or suicidal ideation, things like that. Handle with Care will be listed as an event like that. A Handle with Care referral means that the child referenced was on the scene of some type of police action, not necessarily as a victim, they could be a bystander or a witness, in the last 24 hours and could exhibit academic, emotional, and/or behavioral problems as a result of exposure to something that was likely traumatic. Please handle him or her with care. What's also important to note with trauma, particularly because children often go into that freeze mode that we talked about before and they disassociate. So often the child might initially exhibit no outward signs, right? Their behavior might be the same, but over the next few days or weeks or sometimes months after a traumatic event is really with children, particularly younger children, that might be when you start to see the outward symptoms of trauma. So it's not necessarily immediately the next day, but with the handle care referral notice, you would know which children to then kind of have special eyes on and look for those symptoms over time. So what do schools do with the handle with care notification? The referral from police arrives at school before the start of the next school day, again, along with the other Safe to Say event notices. A school will follow their own Safe to Say communication procedures as they've developed them within their school and district with handle care referrals. The notification does not stay in a child's permanent record. The most appropriate things to remember if you receive a handle with care notice on a child, do not ask the child what happened. That would be re-traumatizing for the child instead of helping that child feel safe and supportive and feeling that they can be safe and get to a place of calm and get into that window of tolerance so that they can learn and succeed in school. Talking about it, being reminded of it, would put them back into that traumatic event and it would re-trigger their survival mode. Also, do not follow up with a referring police officer for more details. They are not permitted to share that information with you. If the event rose to that level where they were obligated to share details, they would share details with the appropriate either county or district staff as well. Do make sure appropriate accommodations are made for the child based on the symptoms. Again, the whole point of Handle with Care is for schools just to have that heads up, to have special eyes on the child the next day. And with that proactive heads up from law enforcement, without the details, no details are needed on what happened. Just that heads up that the child may be coming in a bit more agitated, might need a bit more time and attention and a bit more time with a kind, caring adult. That's all the schools really need to be putting in place interventions and supports to support that student. So you receive a Handle with Care referral notice and the next day in school. Look for things like, is the child hungry? Are they falling asleep in class? Do they look like they're in shock? That disassociated flat affect, zoning out. Are they failing a test? Having an outburst? Acting differently than they normally do? Those would all be signs that maybe the child needs some extra time and attention. What's important to keep in mind with trauma-informed schools, they are safe places where students can learn to build positive relationships, learn to manage their emotions, feel supported, and ultimately help succeed academically and socially. So what's the difference between, having Handle with Care and not having Handle with Care? For example, a child didn't bring in their homework. Typical example, if law enforcement was involved at a house the night before because of a domestic dispute, that's going to take a long time, many hours, a lot of chaos, a lot of fighting, working with the police, negotiating different parent caregivers, and however the situation gets resolved. It's likely the child didn't have time for their homework, didn't complete their homework. So a child comes in without their homework. Without Handle with Care, the child might get a 0 or lose recess or lose some other reward. Right? If that Handle with Care notice comes in and the teacher is aware of what happened, not the details of what happened, but just that something happened that prevented the child from doing homework, teacher might give that child extra time to do the homework or offer some one-on-one help, or just give the child a pass for not doing their homework that day. Similarly, if the child's not falling asleep in class, there might be a punitive consequence if we don't have that Handle with Care notice. But if we do have that notice, then the child might not have slept the night before. So you're going to give that child a pass to go see the nurse so that maybe they can get some sleep. Similarly, if there's an altercation at lunch or recess, without that notice, you might go right to the punitive. But if you knew and had that Handle with Care notice, you might understand they're a bit more agitated. They're in that survival mode. So maybe there was no scuffle because the child was rested and supported and had a good start to the day. maybe an extra snack as well from staff. So again, we're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We really have to begin with the physiological needs, safety, basic needs, before we can move into a sense of belonging and trust, a sense of agency and self-esteem, to then move into that self-actualization mode. And really that learning really takes place in that esteem and self-actualization mode. But we can't get there with our children unless their basic needs are met and there's a sense of safety and they feel a sense of belonging. So making sure the child feels safe, supported, nurtured, and that their needs are met is key to get to the learning that we would like for students. So a key trauma-informed approach with schools, we first realize the impact. These are the 3 R's. There are 3 E's of trauma. There are 3 R's of a trauma-informed school approach. First, realizing the impact of adverse childhood experiences on the neurobiological development and attachment, recognizing the impact of trauma on learning and behavior, and then responding with trauma-informed practices by building resiliency and avoiding re-traumatization. There are 3 R's, so 3 E's of trauma, 3 R's of a trauma-informed approach, and 3 R's of trauma-informed practice. The behavior we see is an expression of their emotional state, right? Instead of beginning with, why did you do that? Because when the child's behavior is really showing that they're in their survival mode, they're in their emotional survival brain, not their learning brain. So we need to first talk to the part of their brain that's in motion right now, right? So that behavior is acting out, that is telling us they're not in their learning brain. They have left their learning brain and they're now in their survival brain. So it's that survival brain we need to speak to. So we first need to help the child regulate, help to establish a sense of calm, safe, emotional state. And once the child feels calm, safe, and supported, then we can work on the reason. But we can't go right to reason first because that part of the brain is offline at the moment. So the 3 R's of trauma-informed practice, first we regulate. And we regulate through relationship. And then once the child is regulated and we have that trusting relationship to help the child stay regulated, then we can move on to reason. So this comes from Jim Sporletter, who was one of the first trauma-informed principals in the country out of Washington. And he has 5 critical steps to implementing a trauma-informed school approach. Really moving from the stress is coming from outside of the school, mantra, behavior is not about me. The strategy, drop your personal mirror. Allow the student to de-escalate and regulate before solving the issue at hand. Mantra, be worked through while in the moment. Practical strategy, designate a quiet space like a peace corner where students can go and feel safe to de-escalate. Third concept, the behavior is never about the issue at hand. It always goes much deeper. Mantra, what's really driving this child's behavior? Practical strategy, be the one who listens and values the student's voice. Ask how you can help. Explore the underlying issues behind the behavior. Fourth concept, it's a brain issue, not a behavioral issue. The mantra being, my job is to help this student regulate, not just simply behave. Practical strategy, incorporate regulatory activities into the culture of the classroom. Integrate that social emotional learning right into daily classroom activities, and support students in their ability to learn how to self-regulate. Fifth key concept, discipline is to teach, not to punish. Mantra, discipline should happen through the context of relationships. Practical strategy, use consequences that keep students in school and foster the building of trust and safety.
I taught for 13 years. So although like thousands of kids that you've had interactions with, sometimes I made judgments about a kid and their disconnect from me or disconnect from a classroom, and I never stopped to ask, hey, what's going on? When you ask those questions and you find out, and then sometimes you look at a kid and you're like, wow, you're here today, and I'm so proud of you that you're here today. And then some kids will look at you and go, because this is the best place to be, and I'd rather be here than what I have to deal with when I'm outside of school.
students who are struggling with something may explode in school or may shut down in school. And many of those students, it's because things are happening in their lives. It could be at home, it could be in the community.
I remember, like it was yesterday, going out to Pittsburgh to a college fair, and we had red bags that we gave them. They left the bags, and I asked the student, why did you leave your bag? And they said, because we live in CRIP territory.
I had another girl that wrote, I have moved 7 times in 7 years. I have learned to not exist. You cannot see inside a human's brain. And when you cannot see inside a human's brain, we make assumptions that a behavior is deliberate, when sometimes the child has got so much stress that their brain has been wired differently.
We know that exposure to adverse childhood experiences reshapes the brain in some really critical ways. Parts of the brain that are responsible for decision-making, regulation of emotion and behaviors, parts of the brain that are responsible for attention. And so when these parts of the brain are influenced in these negative ways, it could have potentially much more negative effects than when trauma is experienced by an adult.
What we identified at our United Way was at the root cause of all those difficult, complex social problems that we were addressing is exposure to childhood trauma. So the best way to support families and support our communities is really by addressing trauma early and building trauma-informed systems to break the cycle of family and community violence and build resilient communities. Resilient Lehigh Valley is a multi-sector partnership of organizations and community members dedicated to our mission of building a trauma-informed and resilient Lehigh Valley through education and collaboration. So through that, we've organized about 100 different organizations and growing, about 160 members and growing, are actively engaged in supporting trauma-informed work.
The heart of a trauma-informed school is the power of a relationship.
Being in trauma-informed school is focusing on the basic needs of our students, making sure they feel safe, that they feel connected.
Your job as educators are not to cure trauma. Our job is to help students through it.
Big things in trauma-informed practices is the way you set up your room. Instead of having rows, you have more clusters and groups so the room doesn't feel so large.
I often would have students be sent to the office because they needed a timeout from the classroom, and now that they have a peace corner, if they need a break, they kind of have that self-regulation ability to kind of go take a break and get back to learning when they're ready.
The main thing is building relationships with kids, resiliency in kids, and the skills that they need to cope with the situation that they're dealing with.
Our students are going through a lot. There are things that are happening in their lives that are so egregious for some of them that they're not going to openly tell you about it. Once you form relationships with kids, once they feel connected to you, many of our kids will tell you. Many of our kids really want to have that conversation.
Our hope with Resilient LV is to create a trauma-informed and resilient community.
We know that Black kids, Latino kids are punished at much greater rates. When we address trauma, we're able to address racial disparities. The shift will be from punishing the kids to actually helping them grow. And when we help them grow, they'll be less likely to repeat the problem behavior, more likely to actually persist in school. We're going to see kids who are going to be able to contribute to the workforce of the Lehigh Valley. Trauma-informed schools can serve as a model for the justice system, for the health system. And in so doing, we'll see healthier and safer communities.
The best benefit of being a trauma-informed school is that we are creating an environment where our students can be the most successful that they can, all of our students.
I've come to understand how much of an epidemic we're in. We've become a safe haven for a lot of our students to just begin to navigate some of the things that they're experiencing.
The best way to trump an adverse childhood experience is a stable, caring adult. We were saying, like, at least someone in your house is caring. We were using those phrases all the time when our students didn't need to hear the at least. What our students needed to hear was, that's a lot that you're telling us. We can't really take some of that away, but what we can do is help you carry it.
So taking a trauma-informed classroom and school approach is one good way to establish really strong Tier 1 whole school strategy approach. When we think of how we best support our students, how we best identify which students need what levels of support, and move them along kind of the cascade of levels of support. Having a trauma lens is key to knowing which students really need what and what strategies might work with which student. So to begin with, a multi-tiered system of supports is a very effective, data-driven, strategic, intentional way of teaming folks to really discuss student needs, but really also building in kind of a strategic, thoughtful, intentional approach to layering supports and moving students up and down this pipeline of supports based on their needs. And again, it really begins with that strong universal approach. So we would highly recommend all schools adopt a trauma-informed classroom approach, because it really does create that strong universal Tier 1 support that would alleviate that very well might meet the needs of most of the students and prevent the need for them to move to a Tier 2 or Tier 3 strategy. But when we think of those other Tier 1 strategies, school-wide PBIS, really recommending an integrated social-emotional learning curriculum, particularly one that focuses on the brain and on emotional regulation. Good behavior games, classroom management, really making sure children understand the physiology for learning, diet, exercise, sleep hygiene, stress management that's taught. And again, the ideal is, that universal Tier 1 approach is working well if it's meeting the needs of that majority, that's 75-90% of students. We move into that Tier 2. So if we have strong, effective Tier 1 strategies in place, then those students that still need more than that, those we know move on to that Tier 2 strategy. Where again, now we're targeting at-risk students, classroom and small group strategies, ideally that 10 to 25% of students. Behavioral contracting, self-monitoring, school-home communications, really focusing on mentoring, differential reinforcement, positive peer reporting, small group social-emotional learning supports. And from there, if there's effective Tier 2 strategies in place, and some students might still need more, and certainly those students that live with that bear, that toxic level stress, might really benefit from strong Tier 1, Tier 2, and perhaps additionally Tier 3 as well. Those are those targeted intensive interventions for those high-risk students, ideally that 3 to 5%. And thinking through cognitive behavioral therapy, there's trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy as well, and that's really where we really want to partner with our school-based behavioral health counselors, our community-based behavioral health partners as well, and really want to be thinking through how we connect and engage families as well. There are also some trauma-informed approaches at the Tier 2, Tier 3 level that are also very effective. There's ESSET, supports for students exposed to trauma. There's CBITS, Cognitive Behavioral Interventions for Trauma in Schools, and the elementary version of CBITS, Bounce Back, as well. I would highly recommend those strategies as well. Other strategies that can be put in place. There are a lot of strategies to be put in place to support students, and really both at a Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 level. So really thinking through creating safe spaces for students to emotionally regulate, those peace corners. Many schools are beginning to adopt this. Also, active listening.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So that video just shows the power of empathy, active listening, and building relationship. And what we know as the brain can be hurt by trauma, the brain can be healed through relationship. So we also want to spend some time during this training to really talk about the impact of trauma on staff. So we kind of talked through the ACEs survey a few slides back and saw how common exposure to childhood trauma is, right? 2/3 in that original study had experienced some form of childhood trauma. Research also tells us that those adults that go into a helping profession, like education or social work, have higher rates of childhood trauma exposure. So we're more vulnerable to impacts of secondary or vicarious trauma, in part because statistically we have higher exposure rates to childhood trauma as a helping profession. And vicarious trauma or secondary trauma is being traumatized through working with others who have directly experienced trauma. So it's not that we are directly experiencing the trauma as professionals, but we're working with, we're caring for, we're worrying about, we're empathizing with students that have directly experienced trauma. And what that does, that can wear on us. We can start to carry around their trauma and feeling for their trauma and caring for them and worry about them really starts to get under our skin and affect us. And that's really what secondary or vicarious trauma is. So some of the physical symptoms, difficulty sleeping, changes in appetite, increased drug or alcohol consumption, impaired immune system, lower energy, exhaustion, feeling of fatigue, aches and pains. Some emotional symptoms, increased anxiety, guilt, irritability or anger, sadness, hopelessness, depression, emotionally shutting down. Some cognitive symptoms of secondary trauma, diminished concentration, harder to focus, loss of interest, self-doubt, perfectionism, difficulty with decisions, poor judgment, hypervigilance. So it might be a good time to pause the recording and just stop and reflect on this. Are you feeling any of this yourselves? Do you see any of this in your colleagues? And what can we do about it? How can we support ourselves and how can we support each other? As we think about trauma-informed schools and trauma-informed practices and responding in a trauma-informed way when we get those handle with care referrals now, we can't pour from an empty cup. Trauma-informed practices requires the adults in the room to have their emotional tanks full. right? So just like in the airline safety, right? We adults need that oxygen tank first before we can put that oxygen mask on the child. So before we can be expected to do trauma-informed practices in the classroom and really empathize and help students emotionally regulate and really provide and use those trauma-informed tools in the classroom to help support students, we really need to focus on self-care, right? We need to be emotionally regulated to model emotional regulation. And to do that, we really need to focus and prioritize our own self-care. So in thinking through professional self-care, and I love this self-care wheel over here, it really breaks it down from the professional, the physical, the psychological, the emotional, spiritual, personal, what we can do, right? So take some time looking through that self-care wheel. Maybe this might be a good opportunity to pause the video again and interact with peers in small groups to really talk through, where does self-care really hit you? And where does that secondary vicarious trauma hit you, right? Where are you feeling it? And what is helpful for you? And then organizationally, as a school, as a district, really thinking through allowing breaks during the workday for staff to be able to self-regulate, engaging with co-workers, how to create peer supports, participating in projects or tasks that are interesting and rewarding, setting limits and boundaries with students and colleagues and bosses, arranging our workspace for comfort, maintaining regular supervision or consultation with a supervisor that really helps us feel supported, feel valued, make sure our supervisor checking on our self-care, really discussing your needs and using the resources you have, participating in a peer support group. There's a lot of mindfulness out there. There's yoga, there's book study clubs, there's walking clubs, a lot of before and after school opportunities you can engage with your peers. Having a kind of a self-care accountability buddy can also really help as well. And some trauma-informed schools, particularly Paxinosa Elementary in Easton, great example of really creating a safe space for staff to self-regulate, to focus on their self-care through transforming their faculty lounge or staff lounge into really a staff wellness room with massage chairs and little sand rakes and yoga mats and different sensory tools to really help staff regulate, feel a sense of calm, to then recharge their batteries and fill up their emotional tanks so that they can be those emotional regulation models and empathy supports, empathic supports for students back in the classroom. So a school-wide trauma-informed approach benefits all children, whether or not we know they've been traumatized, involves the whole school staff from your bus drivers to your custodians, to your cafeteria workers, to your classroom teachers, counselors, beyond. Provides teachers with the supports they need to address trauma's impact on learning, and really looks at the child's behavior from a very different perspective. So in addition to the recording of this training and the PowerPoint, all staff will also receive a Handle with Care chip sheet with do's and don'ts when they receive a Handle with Care notice on a child. Again, the number one don't ask the child what happened the night before, because that would be re-traumatizing. Don't follow up with law enforcement to get the details. We don't need the details. We really just need to focus on a positive, safe, nurturing relationship with a child and meeting the child's symptoms where they are and providing those supports. All staff will also receive a quick practical guide on how to set up and create a trauma-informed classroom as well. So thank you for beginning your trauma-informed journey. Please visit www.resilientlehighvalley.org for more resources on trauma-informed education and tools. And I wish you a wonderful school year.